Okay, we're here in Arlington, Virginia. It's January 3rd, 2010. I'm here with Paul Ress, and this morning I'd like to ask Paul what it was like working for the Herald Tribune in France. And I'd like you to start by explaining how you got your job in the first place.
Well, those days were great days for journalism. I walked into the Herald Tribune, went up a couple of flights in the elevator, and just walked into the office. There was no check of any kind. And somebody said to me on the paper, "What are you looking for?" I said, "A job." And they said, "You've got it." Well, the job consisted of going for beer and sandwiches for the real journalists on the paper. Still, got my foot in the door. And after a couple of months of doing nothing but looking for beer and sandwiches, I was asked if I'd write a movie review. And I said, "Oh, sure." And the trouble was that the film was in French, and I didn't understand much French. So I needed my then woman friend, who became my wife, Blanchette, to tell me what had happened in the movie. And they said, "How about a theater review? Would you like to, can you do that?" I said, "Oh, sure." Not that I'd ever done one, but you do the best you can. And those were the days when you played baseball against the Associated Press in the Bois de Boulogne. It was a great place to be. And it led, of course, to the inevitable being laid off, like today in 2010. In those days, they were laying you off, and I got laid off. I thought it was the last job I'd ever get. It was the first one, but it wasn't the last.
Well, who were some of the journalists that you worked with at the Tribune?
Well, one was Art Buchwald, whom everybody has heard of, because he eventually ended up in Washington. And he came in about a year and a half or two after me. I got there in early March of 1947. That's a long time ago. And Art Buchwald arrived about a year and a half later. And he wanted to have, and did have, dinners with people like Darryl Zanuck and Elizabeth Taylor and, people from Hollywood. And that wasn't my idea why I was in France. And so the editor, Eric Hawkins, called me in and said, "Would you mind if Art Buchwald took your column and wrote mostly about people?" I was hardly in a position to say to the managing editor, "No, I won't give up my job," so I did. And that was the end of that. But Buchwald was a lot funnier than I could have been, and he was a very good correspondent.
Were there other reporters you remember from that period?
Sorry?
Do you remember other reporters from that period?
Well, let me think. It's hard to name the names. I'm just trying to think of some of the people. No, I don't remember the names. That's a long time ago, 1947.
But you kept up with Buchwald a little bit, right?
Oh yeah, I saw Art Buchwald about, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 months ago, shortly before he died. And of course his first story was hilarious, and it's worth telling. He was sent up to Deauville, which was a fancy place, because the Herald Tribune had one of those advertising supplements, and they needed to have some prose, some stories in the supplement. So Art Buchwald went up there, and he stayed at a fancy hotel, and I think it was the Normandy. And then he said he looked at the book of people registering. In those days, you had to put your name down, and he saw names of famous people like Henry Ford III and the Aga Khan and Johnny Agnelli, everybody who was anybody. So he said that in his column, he said that if you went to the Normandy Hotel, you found yourself sleeping in the next room with so-and-so. Then he said you couldn't possibly have dinner there. You had to go to a famous restaurant, which he named. And there you found yourself having dinner. At the next table was, and he went through his whole list again of about 20 well-known people. And finally, he went on to say, but you couldn't, in Deauville you had to gamble, so you went to the casino. And there you had the same list of people, the same impressive list of 20 famous people. And then, of course, he ended up by saying, naturally, you couldn't end with losing or winning money at the casino. You had to go to Beau Brummel for one for the road. Then he turned in his story to Eric Hawkins, and he read it, didn't smile, Hawkins, and he said to Art Buchwald, one of his first efforts, being funny, and Hawkins said to him, "Art, it's all right, but why do you keep repeating these names?" That was pretty discouraging for Art or for anybody. The paper was it was fun, but it was not very professional. And Hawkins was there. He was the son of a jockey from Newcastle, and he'd just been around for so long that he ended up the managing editor.
Wow. So like, how big was the Paris bureau?
Well, it was the Paris paper. We had I would say about 15 staffers, and many of them came from Stars and Stripes, the Army publication. They hadn't ever gone home to the States. One of them was my friend Bob Haney, who's still very much alive in Washington, D.C.
Bob worked for the Tribune as well?
Oh, yeah, he worked for the Tribune. Yeah. And he cost me a lot of meals because he had a good salary and I had a pathetic salary. Uh-huh. My first salary was $28 a month. A month! $28. Even in those days, the dark ages, it didn't amount to much. And so I'd spend money on a dinner with him, and then I wouldn't have any more money left. There was one good thing about the paper, though. The editor of the paper was Jeffrey Parsons, and he had founded the newspaper guild in Boston. So he was management, of course, and the boss, but he had something of the mentality of a union journalist. So he gave everybody home leave. So I got a free trip back to the States when I didn't have a penny. So that was rather good.
Oh, yeah. So you said it was the Paris paper. Does that mean that it was only distributed in Paris at that time?
Yes, it wasn't an international paper, and it had a certain independence. It wasn't owned by the New York Times or the Washington Post in those days, and so you didn't have to.
Well, it wasn't part of the Times system at all?
Not at the beginning, no.
No, it was an independent paper.
It was an independent paper, and a lot of journalists liked that. They felt that it was better to work for an independent paper in Paris than to be working for a newspaper in New York City, which is the case today. I found out many, many years later that when I tried to write an obituary about a friend, Don Allen, in the Herald Tribune, they said, "We can't publish it until the New York Times and New York tells us we can." That was discouraging.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it led to about 12 people leaving the Herald Tribune when the New York Times forced out the Washington Post.
Yeah.
And what permitted them to leave was this. Right after the war, the French journalists made an arrangement with the newspapers that if you work for a newspaper, and let's say Murdoch bought it, and you didn't want to work for Murdoch, then you had a right. You use your conscience, which prevented you from working for Murdoch, so you could quit and get all your pension pay and everything else. You would go off with everything you were entitled to, and you didn't have to explain why you left. You just said, "I can't work for this man. I didn't join the Herald Tribune to work for Murdoch, so I quit." And about 12 people quit all at once, and there were a lot of jobs open, I suppose, at the Herald Tribune then.
So it was started as like a paper primarily in Paris for expats. Is that correct?
Yeah, almost all of the writers were. Pi Chamberlain was one. I can't think of all their names now, but they were all coming from the armed forces.
But in terms of the readers, though.
Oh, the readers were in Paris and France and in Europe, but not so much in Europe. I mean, it wasn't an international paper, and it had a small circulation. It didn't make much money, if any, and the salaries were all right for the top people, but poor for people like me. But of course, today, if you try to walk into the Herald Tribune, you get a good kick in the pants. You'd never get through. Not a chance.
Yeah.
And years later, when I went to work for Time magazine, I again walked into the office, walked upstairs, and nobody stopped me. And I saw Art Buchwald and Frank White and Kurt Prendergast playing gin rummy. And they stopped long enough to say to me, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm looking for a job." They said, "Well, you've got it." Those were the days. I said, "How about that job in the Riviera?" "Oh, you want that one?" he said. I said, "Yeah, that sounded like a good job." And it had been held by a woman named Sally Carthage, good name, and Carthage, in her case, had to be destroyed. And she made a great mistake. She put on her expense account that she had had champagne with Onassis on his boat, and she had paid for the champagne, and she put that in her expense account. She got fired.
For that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you hardly expect to pay for champagne for a man as rich as Onassis on his yacht.
Yeah.
What she put in for it.
Okay, let me